Back, we're reading Martin Heidegger's Metaphysics. He was a German philosopher. And we are on chapter 4, and this chapter is titled The Restriction of Being. Hope you're all having a great day. Just as we find a perfectly ordinary way of saying being in the is. Okay, so being and then linked to is, remember. We also find very definite turns of phrase that have already become formulaic in the naming of the name being. Being and becoming, being and seeming, being and thinking, being and the ought. When we say being, we are driven almost as if under the compulsion to say being and ... The and does not simply mean that we incidentally attach and add something else, but rather that we speak of something from which being is distinguished. Okay, so not just simply adding things on, right? But that we are distinguishing being and not, but at the same time we mean in these formulaic phrases something more than somehow properly belongs to being as something distinguished from it, if only as something other to it. The course of our questioning up to this point has not only clarified its domain, to be sure, we have primarily taken up the question itself, the fundamental question of metaphysics, only as something passed on. Okay, so a fundamental question of physics as something passed on and proposed to us from some source. But the question has plainly unveiled itself to us. Not really. I don't want to say it's plainly unveiled. Notice how he uses the word unveiled, right? Veiled, unveiled. There's a lot of language in here. To us in its questioning worthiness. Okay. So the question is unveiling itself to us, quite plainly, he says. More and more, it now proves to be a concealed ground of our historical Dasein. Remember, he uses this phrasing, historical Dasein. It will remain this even and precisely when, self-satisfied and busy with all kinds of things, we wander around over this ground as over a thinly covered abyss. Wow. But what happens when that thin layer of the abyss happens? We just fall into despair? What's he gonna say? Or chaos, kind of like, what was her name? Alice's Wonderland? Precisely when self-satisfied and busy with all kinds of things, we wander around over this ground as over a thinly covered abyss. We will now pursue the distinctions between being and some other. In doing this, we will learn that, contrary to the widely accepted opinion, being is anything but an empty word for us. Instead, it is determined in so multifaceted a fashion that we can hardly manage to preserve this determination sufficiently. Okay, so he is taking disagreement with saying that being is just an empty word, but that it's actually a multifaceted word, and it actually helps preserve things sufficiently concerning their determination. But that is not enough. This experience must be developed into a grounding experience for our future historical Dasein. So we need to develop it so that we can be more grounded. So that we can participate in carrying out the distinctions in the right way from the start, we offer the following points of orientation. Points of orientation. Orientation, how to orient yourself so that you can go on the straight way. Being is delimited against some other and thus already has a determinateness in the setting of a limit. 2. The delimitation happens in 4 interrelated respects. 4. Accordingly, the determinateness of being must either be ramified or heightened or else diminished. Wow, okay. So the determinants of being have to be ramified, heightened, or diminished. Interesting. 3. These distinctions are by no means accidental. What is held apart by them belongs together originally and tends to come together. Hence, these separations have their own necessity. Okay, so that basically the separations have their own necessities. Distinctions are not by accident. 4. Therefore, the oppositions that initially strike us as mere formulas did not come up on arbitrary occasions, and enter language as figures of speech, as it were. They arose in close connection with the shaping of being, whose openness became definitive for the history of the West. They had their inception with the inception of philosophical questioning. Look at that. They had their inception with the inception of philosophical questioning. With Heidegger, man, you're gonna go into another word, into another word, he's so unique. The distinctions have not remained dominant only within Western philosophy. They pervade all knowing, doing, and speaking, even when they are not expressed explicitly or in these words. Look at that. So even when it's not explicitly expressed, the distinctions are not really that dominant at times. 6. The sequence in which we listed the terms already gives an indication of the order of their essential connection and of the historical sequence in which they were shaped. Wow. Already gives an indication. Interesting. The two distinctions we named first, being and becoming. Okay, being and becoming. Being and seeming already get formed at every inception of Greek philosophy. At the most ancient, they are also the most familiar. That's true, right? The third distinction, being and thinking, which was foreshadowed in the inception no less than the first two, unfolds its definitively in the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, but first takes on its real form at the beginning of modernity. In fact, it plays an essential part in this beginning. In accordance with its history, this distinction is the most complex and, with regard to its intent, the most questionable. This is why it remains for us the most worthy of question. Being and thinking. Okay, so for Aristotle, first unfolds definitively philosophy of Plato and Aristotle. Plato's forms. Plato thinking of the outer forms, the good. Aristotle looking kind of more to the earth, the being and the thinking, and how they relate our existing to our thinking. Okay. The fourth distinction, being and ought, belongs thoroughly to modernity. Okay, so he's contending that what ought to be when something is being is a modern conception. It is prefigured only distantly by the characterization of on, being, what is, as agathon, good, since the end of the 18th century. It has determined one of the predominant positions of the modern spirit towards being in general. 7. Asking the question of being in an originary way, in a way that grasps the task of unfolding the truth of the essence of being. Again, look at that. So, the task of unfolding the truth of the essence of being. It's an unfolding, right? Unveiling. Remember he used that language? It means facing the decision, Echtenstung, regarding the concealed powers in these distinctions, Unterschneidenden, and it means bringing them back to their own truth. Wow. Those German words are very powerful then. All of these preliminary remarks should remain continually in view during the following considerations. Okay, and then the next one says, paragraph, being and becoming. This separation and opposition stands at the inception of the questioning of being. Even today, it is still the most familiar restriction of the being through some other, for it is immediately obvious, due to the representation of being, that has hardened into the self-evident. What becomes is not yet, what is no longer needs to become, what is beings has left all becoming behind it, if indeed it ever became or could become. What is, in the authentic sense, also stands up against every onslaught from becoming. Yeah, what becomes is not yet. Yeah, because it hasn't really finished yet. When you're being, it almost implies that you are at a certain stage of development and maybe won't progress any further. Is doesn't imply becoming an end, like what he contended, right? Living at the turn of the 5th century BC, Parmenides The poetic thinker set forth the being of what is, in contrast to becoming. His didactic poem has been handed down only in fragments, but these are great and essential. Here we will cite only a few verses. Fragment 8, lines 1 through 6. Ooh, and it even has the original Greek, look. Can you see it? Greek looks weird, but it looks cool. But there remains solely the saga of the way along which there opens up, how it stands with to be, sign, for along this way many indications of it are given, how being without genesis and without decay, complete, standing fully there alone, without trembling in itself, so being doesn't have trembling in itself, and not at all indeed of finishing, exactly, I thought so, nor was it before, nor will it be some day, for as the present it is all at once, unique, unifying, united, gathering itself in itself, from itself, holding itself together, full of presentness. Exactly. Oh, that's brilliant. I love it when you're reading philosophy and your train of thoughts are just going along and you're like totally in the flow with the philosopher. It's brilliant. Indeed, Parmenides. Do I have one of his books? I don't remember. Brilliant. Brilliant. What do you think, family? You're learning a lot about metaphysics.